Okay. Good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome everyone to the thesis defense of Luis Reyes Rivera, who has worked on an annotated translation of excerpts from the text L'œil moteur, art optique et cinétique 1950 à 1975. I would also like to extend my gratitude to the readers on the thesis committee for their participation in this defense. Thank you very much, Professors Mercedes Trelles and Antoine Philippe Bernard. Okay, Luis will begin with a presentation on this project, and we will then proceed to a discussion headed by the committee members.
Okay. Okay, does it look good? Right. So good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I would just like to thank the graduate program in translation for all the learning experiences throughout the years. And I'm just thrilled to be closing this chapter of my career with my final thesis project titled The Motor Eye, Op and Kinetic Art 1950 to 1975. Which is a French to English translation of excerpts from L'œil moteur art cinétique 1950 à 1975. And so L'œil moteur was an exhibition organized in 2005 at the Strasbourg Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in France, as pictured above. And it was one of the largest retrospectives ever dedicated to optical and kinetic art. So while the thematic center of the exhibition was l'œil moteur, or the motor eye, this concept was further declined into three axes. We have l'œil corps, or the body eye, l'œil computer, also called l'œil neuronal, or the neuronal eye, and finally, l'œil sonore, or the sound eye. And so the catalog dedicated to this exhibition features photographs of works of art that were shown at the museum, and also contains a series of texts that address optical and kinetic art from these four axes. These texts were written by a group of art historians, art history professors, curators, and museum directors. Them being Emmanuel Guigon, Arnauld, Pierre, Anna Dezeuze, Pascal Rousseau, Marcella, Lista, Mathieu Poirier, Alexandre Poix, and Michel Gauthier. However, my translations are focused on the motor eye, body eye, and sound eye sections by Pierre, Dezeuze, and Lista, as well as the introduction by Emmanuel Guigon and the afterword by Michel Gauthier. And already the cover of the catalog gives us an idea of what this is about. I found that the design of the cover resembles the painting Fall by Bridget Riley. These curved lines give the viewer the illusion of movement, also thanks to the highly contrasting black and white. And in an exhibition setting, this illusion is exacerbated by the movement of the viewer, even by simply shifting the weight of their body from one leg to the other. And to the right, we have painting Gamma by Victor Vasarely. I included this as an example because the target motif is recurrently used to provide a fixed center and a stronger optical focus. These paintings were considered by critics and the public as nauseating. So the way I see it, movement is also explored in optical art by forcing the viewer to look away from the painting. However, this exploration with movement goes as far back as 1920s surrealism. We have, for example, these works by Marcel Duchamp, who is more famously known for a urinal that he exhibited as a ready-made sculpture, but he is also credited to contributions to kinetic art, such as his photorelief or his optical discs. Here, the eye does not react in the same way as with Riley and Vasarely's paintings, but when these optical discs are spun, we better understand Duchamp's decision not to align the centers at align the circles at the center of the disc. The non-concentric circles give us this impression of depth and movement. And so this is another example of a technique that is often used in this kind of art, the trompe-l'œil technique, which translates as to fool or to deceive the eye. And so much like how the movement of the body exacerbates the optical illusion in optical art, in kinetic works, the viewer is invited to see through the body, which explains the concept of the body eye. In a work such as the Penetrables by Jesus Rafael Soto, there is no longer any distance between the viewer and the work. This results in a multi-sensory exploration through touch. The viewer can walk freely across this installation while feeling the strings against their skin. So for this reason, the terms optical and kinetic are intertwined because both these currents share a relationship with movement. And so since sight and touch are important senses for optical and kinetic artists, there have also been experiments with sound. As per the message at the beginning of this film, an optical poem by Oscar Fischinger, to most of us, music suggests definite mental images of form and color. The picture you're about to see is a novel scientific experiment. Its object is to convey these mental images in visual form. Throughout the film, the shapes and colors move according to the musical composition. So in that sense, it is a synesthetic experience. And this is where the idea of a sound eye comes in, or the idea of seeing through sound. Years later, contemporary artists would continue to pay homage to optical art. Here, for example, the work Three Little Words, where John Tremblay makes use of the black and white stripes that are idiosyncratic of optical art. However, the targets appear to be melting, they are skewed to the side. And not only that, but instead of having one supposed center at which to take aim, we have three target-like objects, which further disorients the viewer. Here we have another example, these works by Ugo Rondinone. We have central fixed targets, but Rondinone makes use of colors other than black and white. And even more strikingly, these targets are blurred. So at first glance, they may seem like optical works, but these targets do not move, and they do not really provide a fixed central point. And then this idea of movement is explored in more outrageous ways, such as the work 360-degree Presence by Jeppe Hein. It is a steel ball that only stops moving and slamming against the walls of the exhibition room when there are no longer any visitors present in the room. So it is a work that acknowledges the presence of the viewer, but it is also asking the viewer to leave in a way, or it will continue destroying the exhibition room. And even a work like this, which is more aesthetically bare, consisting only of a light bulb in an empty room, could be considered an example of optical, or rather kinetic art. This is because there is also this ominous, threatening voice that whispers the words of the title of the work: "Get out of my mind, get out of this room." So here, movement is manifested by straight up asking the viewer to leave the exhibition room. And so this was an overview of the contents of the catalog. And so given the heady subject matter, we can already imagine some of the challenges that I faced while translating these texts. The main challenge I faced was my initial lack of familiarity with the subject, combined with my position as a C language translator. This is because it is generally preferable for the translator to work with their so-called first languages, as well as with subject matters that they are specialized in. In addition to that, in the art history field, Translation goes beyond the translation from one language to the other, which was named by Roman Jacobson as interlingual translation. But we also have intersemiotic translation, which is the translation of one semiotic code to another, in this case, visual to textual. In their article, Art History and Translation, Ian White Boyd and Claudia Heide bring up the concept of ekphrasis, which they define as the construction of texts that are able to describe, evoke, and analyze a work of art. So in this sense, the art historian and translator share a similar role, but this poses a risk. Any mistranslation of visual arts terminology could stray away from the reality of the visual work. So here I'm using Vasarely's kinetic wall as an example, and I highlighted three main descriptors. For instance, the term intégration architecturale, or architectural integration. I found it important to know that this is not a description by the author, Arnauld Pierre, in this case, who wrote the motor eye text, but rather this refers to a series of works by Victor Vasarely that integrate art into architecture and public spaces. So the kinetic wall is only one example of these architectural integrations. Then for the term panneau en lame d'aluminium, I considered the difference between two different translations I found of this term, panels and slats, which I believe they differ in size. A slat is thinner than a panel, so I had to take careful consideration of the translation of materials as well. And then a phrasing such as motif de cible aux anneaux décalés et perpétuellement vibrant, which I believe I successfully translated as a target motif with staggered rings in perpetual vibration. And lastly, I would argue that there is also the translation of the ideas of the artist into the work, where the artist has to ask themselves, what materials do I use? What colors do I use? What ideas do I want to represent in my work? And so to aid in my translation, this is just an overview of the sources I consulted, Corpora, bilingual dictionaries, and monolingual dictionaries that help me understand the different nuances of French words. But these sources were ultimately not exhaustive because of the many instances of unique writing across the text. So on many occasions, I had to find my own workarounds. And for this reason, my main approach to these texts was to demystify and to provide clarity to the reader. As I kept researching to understand the text for my own benefit and provide translations that were as accurate as possible, I came across many findings that I believe would help not just me as a translator, but also the reader. So to my understanding, this leans toward the domestication end of the domestication formalization spectrum as theorized by Lawrence Venuti, meaning that I adapted as often as I could the source text for my target audience. Other examples of domestication include translating the titles of works of art into English, finding English translations of citations, and therefore swapping the French bibliographical references with the English ones, and converting the measurements of works from centimeters to inches. But in reality, I found myself oscillating between the two strategies. So some of my more foreignizing decisions were not made with the intention to alienate the reader. Rather, it was because I could not find an alternative. For example, when dealing with some instances of wordplay in French, one instance of a work of art in Portuguese that I did not translate, which I will explain later, bibliographical works that do not have an English translation, and French terms for which I could not find an English equivalent, such as régime, which I will also explain in a bit, but also others such as fait opéral and instance vocale. And so style was another main challenge that I faced in the translation of these texts, especially because I am not only translating one author, but 5 authors. So the texts varied a lot stylistically and thematically. And so I also came across this phenomenon coined as International Art English, which reveals an interesting relationship between French and English in the art field, and therefore it contextualized my own endeavor to translate these texts. This is related to an essay called International Art English, published in Triple Canopy and written by Alex Rule and David Levine. And to better understand this concept, I came across this article from The Guardian, which says that Rule and Levine found that the real, used as a pretentious would-be philosophical abstract noun, occurred 179 times more often in International Art English than in Standard English. In fact, in its declarative multi-clause sentences and in its odd combination of stiffness and swagger, they argued that International Art English sounds like inexpertly translated French. This was no coincidence, having traced the origins of International Art English back to French post-structuralism and the introduction of its slippery ideas and prose style into American art writing. Since then, International Art English had spread across the world so thoroughly that there was even an International Art English of the French press release written, we can only imagine, by French interns imitating American interns, imitating American academics, imitating French academics. And so if the issue was not with the style of French, it had to do with the presence of other languages in the text. So I faced some instances of Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Russian, even Yiddish and Latin, and English words embedded in the French texts. And this is partly due to the extensive bibliography that is featured in the catalog. So this is just a sample of different additional works that I have to consult to see if an English translation of a citation existed and to see if it was also available to me. So in the case where I could not find or access the translation of a citation, I will provide my own. So all in all, these are 3 main challenges that I faced in this process related to style, terminology, and intertextuality. So now I would just like to provide some examples of these categories. For instance, we have this passage from the introduction Les Illusions de Beauville by Emmanuel Guigon. The passage reads, Jacques Prévert a inventé un curieux néologisme pour désigner le caractère insolite des œuvres de Vasarely à l'occasion de sa première exposition à la Galerie Denis René en 1944, Imaginatoire, which I have translated as Jacques Prévert coined a clever neologism to describe the unusual character of Vasarely's works on his debut exhibition at the Galerie Denis René in 1944, Imaginoire. So here I corrected the term imaginatoire with imaginoire simply to avoid repeating the error in the source text. And I was able to confirm this through these various sources. We have, for example, the poem by Jacques Prévert, which is titled not imaginatoire, but imaginoire. And then we have this explanation of the term in a catalog dedicated to Vasarely's work, which explains that imaginoire is a combination of the French words imaginaire and noir. In the middle, this term was translated as black imaginaries, but I did not use this translation, especially because this seems to be a common error. Below, on a website dedicated to Vasarely's work, the term is cited as imaginaire, not imaginoir. And Imaginaire is not the poem by Jacques Prévert, but rather an anthology of poems as seen above, so a different text. So here I opted for a foreignizing approach, again, to keep the wordplay visible, to highlight the importance of correcting the source text, but also because we find other instances of wordplay in the text by Guigon. So above, we have another passage by Guigon, which highlights the anagram between the French words image and magie, which would not be possible with the words image and magic. And Guigon also quotes this passage from André Breton's novel Nadja, where in the 1960 translation by Richard Howard, the word rouge, which means red, was left untranslated to highlight its resemblance to the word police and therefore insist on this optical illusion that André Breton was speaking of. So here, a foreignizing approach seemed appropriate because one of the recurring ideas of the text is how optical illusions also occur in language. Now, when facing the motor eye text, I came across an entirely different set of challenges. I won't go into detail with this passage, but I found these to be very long-winded passages that took me a few tries, actually, to translate properly, and that could even risk reading as international art English or simply clumsy English. So the way I see it, this is just one example of textual mystification and inaccessibility to this kind of knowledge. And not only that, but this text also had a high number of technical vocabulary. One particular term being régie, which was an interesting challenge because here the author uses the terms régime and vitesse in the same passage, and both of them can be translated as speed. However, I found that one definition of régime is that of rotational speed or speed of rotation of a motor. So here, I was able to make the link between régime and the idea of a motor eye. And so because other English translations of régime do not seem to capture this idea of the speed of a rotation, I simply borrow the term from French. And so my sentence reads, the régime of movement pertains to speed and acceleration. So I do understand that there is a risk to this because a term like régime may not be easily understandable by my target audience. But while I didn't use these strategies in my translation, I also considered alternatives such as a translator's note or providing additional information within the text simply to clarify the French meaning of a term. So while a word like régime in this context has no apparently any direct equivalent in English, I still try to find any previously translated content related to the catalog. And in this process, I came across two translations of L'Œil Moteur, which I did not use. I found the Kinetic Art as a translation for the title of the exhibition and the Moving Eye for the title of the catalog in an Amazon listing. But while these translations more or less convey the same idea of L'Œil Moteur, Pierre does clarify the origins of the term. So below we have two references that Pierre cites, the first being an interview with Jesus Rafael Soto himself, who is cited as saying, yo he solamente utilizado el ojo como motor, en ningún momento he querido utilizar el motor eléctrico de la cuestión mecánica, he querido utilizar al espectador como la mecánica. And Pierre also cites Michel Gauthier, who writes, l'œil est comme le moteur qui doit animer la surface, des procédés optiques changent les formes et les couleurs. So here we have in Spanish and French the use of moteur and moteur. So this is why I thought the motor eye would be a more appropriate translation than something like the kinetic eye or the moving eye. So here I suddenly found myself dealing with Spanish in Pierre's text. Meanwhile, in the Loicor section, I came across many references in Portuguese because of the text. The text's focus on Brazilian art. For example, this passage concerning the manipulable sculptures by Lydia Clark, known in Portuguese as the bichos, and which have been translated as critters, but also animals, beasts, and creatures. And so in this passage, the author cites Lydia Clark's French translation of her own words in Portuguese, as seen below in the footnote. So I felt compelled to keep the title of the word bicho in Portuguese and translate this instance of bets into English. Basically, keep the Portuguese but translate the French. And so I believe that an advantage to leaving the title untranslated is the nuance of the Portuguese bicho, since one of the definitions I found of it in Portuguese was that it is an imaginary being used to scare children. And in a 2006 lecture by Anna Dezeuze, the author of this text, titled Minimalism and Neoconcretism, she writes that secrecy and mystery were also associated with Clark's bichos in early descriptions. One critic even called them diabolical because the discovery of their secret geometric structure is usually frustrated by their spatial complexity. So in my opinion, these two facts go in line with the reputation that these works have, and therefore I thought that keeping the Portuguese title seemed appropriate. Another work that caused me a great deal of consideration was that of the Proyecto para un muro exterior by Carlos Cruz Diaz. This work is described by Dezeuze as dans ce projet, le spectateur est invité à se déplacer latéralement pour percevoir les facettes colorées de baguettes de bois qui s'entrecroisent sur les murs. And instead of providing a French translation, she cites it in Spanish, Proyecto para un mural exterior. I translated this passage as the viewer is invited to move laterally to perceive the colored facets of the crisscrossing wooden strips on the wall. And then I added first project for an exterior wall. I had considered using project for an exterior wall, but I found it to be listed on the website of the Museum of Modern Art in reference to a work that does not match this description provided by Dezeuze. So here, as seen above, according to the Museum of Modern Art, project for an exterior wall is more akin to circular shapes that are fixed to the wall. And below, according to the Centre Pompidou website, it appears with the Spanish title Proyecto para un mural exterior, in French, Projet pour un mur extérieur. In addition to this description provided actually by Arnauld Pierre, who uses the title Proyecto para un mural exterior Caracas. Despite these inconsistencies, I would say the photographs of the work, as we can see, were taken from 3 different angles to imitate this lateral movement described by Dezeuze. But then I found in I believe it's a catalog titled Carlos Cruz Diaz in Conversation with Ariel Jimenez, which has a transcription of words from interviews with Carlos Cruz Diaz himself. And regarding this work, Cruz Diaz explains that the piece is now part of the collection of the Centre Georges Pompidou, Primer Proyecto para un Muro Exterior, first project for an exterior wall. And later it is listed as figure 10, which is the image to the right, which corresponds to the description by Dezeuze. And Above, we see the artwork that is listed as project for an exterior wall in MoMA, but it appears translated in this caption as maquettes for an exterior wall. So generally, considering that this was taken from a series of interviews with the artist, I considered it to be a more reliable source. And in this section, if the problem wasn't with the title itself, it was the lack of a title. So, for example, at the passage at the left, Clark explicitly mentions the Bichos by their title, but the passage follows a work by Elio Oitichica without naming the title. I translated this passage as Elio Oitichica suspended painted wooden slats to create environments that could be discovered by walking. And by researching further, I found that it is in reference to his grande núcleo, and so that helped me confirm that I was using the correct description of the work. And in this other passage that I translated as the wooden toys created by Uruguayan artist Joaquín Torres Garcia, painted figurines that a child can freely assemble and rebuild, I found that it was in relation to the Jouet Transformable Aladdin. And so I believe that these findings could be used to provide clarity to the reader. I simply chose not to include those explanations, believing that there could be an intention by part of the author to not include the titles of these works. And so if the problem I faced was not related to the title of the work, it was related to the description of the work. So this was a puzzling passage from Marcella Lista's sound-eye text. It reads, Entre 1962 et 1964, Frank Malina élabore ses premières œuvres audiocinétiques sous le titre générique de Chromie, en intégrant dans son boîtier une tour de couleur dont la mise en mouvement par un moteur s'accompagne d'un son dont l'intensité est fonction de la vitesse du mouvement. And I have translated this as from 1962 to 1964, Frank Malina created his first audio-kinetic prototypes under the generic title of Chromie by integrating into their casing a tower of colors with a motor-driven movement that was accompanied by a sound, the intensity of which depended on the speed of the movement. So my translation of tour de couleur comes from my understanding of the French word tour, so I used tower. However, a description like tower of colors remained a mystery to me. I was unable to picture such a thing, and at the time of my translation, I was unable to find any texts or images that confirmed this so-called tower of colors. However, I later came across this text called The Domestication of Kinetic Art, which describes the Chromie prototype as Chromie numéro 1 is a kinetic object in which an incandescent lamp placed on the side of the case projects a beam of light into a rotating color wheel. So a description as rotating color wheel makes more sense to me technically, but I still could not understand this concept of a tour de couleur. So in a case like this, I would update my translation by using this description as a reference, hoping that it would be more accurate as opposed to possibly having mistranslated this idea of a tour de couleur. Now, this was a recurring issue in the sound-eye text. Above we see examples of these obscure instruments, experiments that were forgotten or undervalued at their time. And even researchers of this domain are aware that this field has not been sufficiently explored. We have these contraptions such as the clavier à lumière, I believe, or the keyboard with lights, the optophone, the clavilux, and other terms like the lumidyne system and the reflectodyne system. So here I found myself diving into a different field, that of musicology. And this text also contains minor instances of languages such as German or Russian. So that was an extra layer of difficulty. So I may have had to deal with, ambiguous terms in multiple languages, but even a term as simple as painting required further consideration. I'm setting here a passage from Michel Gauthier's Afterword, and I will focus on these highlighted terms. So this smaller passage reads, Robert Hyman s'attachait à dénuder les divers constituants de la peinture et du tableau. To translate it as Robert Ryman endeavored to strip away the various constituents of the painting and the act of painting itself. I did this because peinture and tableau can both be translated as painting, but to my understanding, peinture here refers to the art form and tableau refers to the painting as an object or the canvas of a painting. And so to avoid unfavorable phrasing such as the various constituents of the painting and painting, I thought it best to use a workaround like this. And this matter of tableau and peinture is also present in the bibliography of the Afterword. It cites this text by New York art critic Robert Nickus in English. People make paintings to prove they exist, which in French appears translated as Les gens font des peintures pour prouver qu'ils existent, which is a fine word-by-word translation, but I found that it was removed from context. In his own text, Nickus provides an explanation of his title. The second to last sentence of this paragraph reads, so when I say that people make paintings to prove they exist, I mean that people make paintings to prove that painting exists. So here, they is not in reference to people, but in reference to paintings. However, in the French translation, il could only refer to gens, which means people, because elle would only be used for peinture. So basically, this was just an example of how a French mistranslation could result in a misunderstanding from my part as a translator. And so for my closing thoughts, I would just like to share these two ideas that I resonated with. First, in their article, Art History and Translation, the authors claim that without translation, there will be no art history. And so this entire process of selecting texts, translating them, editing them, researching, it taught me about the increasing importance of human translation overall, especially in texts of this nature. It was such a meticulous process that I discovered that there was an even closer connection than I imagined between art history and translation, in the sense that translation itself felt like an art form. A lot of it was left to subjective reasoning from my part, in the same way that much of this art, which is very abstract in nature, leaves free room for interpretation. And because a translator basically has to not just read a text, but also scrutinize it, there were so many other micro-level decisions that they were no less important, but would have taken me forever to explain today. So I really enjoyed this quote by Jacques Derrida that I stumbled upon in my research that I feel summarizes this whole endeavor. Rien n'est plus sérieux qu'une traduction, or nothing is as serious as a translation. So that would be it for my presentation, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Luis. That was really very thorough and really interesting. And I guess you forced us down various rabbit holes. I wanted to say that the tour de couleur, it dawned on me that, I don't know, possibly color circuit?
Oops.
Possibly, because it sounds like it from the description. But in any event, I want to thank you, and I also want to thank you for involving me in this project. I would like to now pass the floor over to the readers here so that they can provide their comments, observations, criticisms, and revisions. Would anyone like to begin? Mercedes or Antoine Philippe?
As you prefer.
Well, since you're there, you can start.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, thank you for inviting me on this committee. First, I'd like to say that I enjoyed your introduction. So basically, now you fleshed it out with some more images and more explanation. But I thought, yeah, you did a very thorough job in explaining your methodology, and I do think your methodology is sound. And I liked how you went about doing it, and how careful you were, how mindful, and I do think, at least from my perspective, because obviously I'm not an art specialist, or I cannot speak about that part. I'm going to focus obviously on the French part, which is my area of specialty. Now, can I ask you a question? What is your experience in French? As a learner of French, what has been your experience?
Okay, well, I have been basically, my major was basically foreign languages, so French was a big part of that curriculum. I studied for 4.5 years at UPR, and since then I just haven't. I've used it in my line of work, in translation work, and yeah, I basically haven't stopped my relationship with language since then.
So how do you? What would you say you do mostly to keep working on your French and learning French?
I have taught French, and if not, I think that part of my one of the main reasons I chose to translate from French was to precisely practice it more and have hands-on experience with the translation.
Okay. No, I like that you said that you taught French, because yes, any teacher knows that you're the one who learns the most whenever you teach and whatever you teach. Okay. Good. Now, I'm going to make a criticism. It is not a huge one, because I do think that most of your translation is good. In its, I would say, in its accuracy and in its form. But I would say there are problems from your, I would say, not being completely familiar with the French language. So I did find that very often you were fully capable of translating quite intricate, difficult, specialized descriptions of very weird, artworks, and but sometimes you missed some, I would say, idiomatic expressions that belong to actually common French, and that were used quite often by the writers that you chose to translate here. So it led you to some inaccuracies, I would say, in understanding exactly what we're saying, sometimes at the level of syntax, for example, when the sentence was a little long. So what is that adjective applying to exactly, or how should you render that tense? So I liked your explanation of why you had to struggle with the present being translated into a preterite, because French use it, in this other sense. But other tenses, sometimes you sort of missed the specificity, and some verbs, the specificity of what they were bringing. And a few times you struggle with something that for the French is rather simple because it's common French. So I'm going to go over I think the three types of difficulties I think you struggle with. I would say some are idiomatic. I would say these are the main ones. In which case it doesn't, I insist, I think your method is sound. But since there's some really, it's more like basic French, so, which means it's not that you don't understand it, is that you fail to perceive how idiomatic that expression is and has a very specific meaning, and also that it would have a specific translation in English. So I would also like to discuss some of the choices that I do not understand and that I thought were not always you were not always being totally faithful to your method, and some of problems of understanding that I mentioned, especially with syntax. So I'll start with page 8 of your introduction with the Roman. And so you translated something that was in the footnote here. In the footnote, you have pensée plastique, and you translate by visual discourse. I do not understand that choice. Discourse is not thought. I think especially when you speak of visual arts, there's an argument to be made that you can think in images. And it has been proven that people cannot reproduce verbatim, and any utterance, because often they have the concept, not necessarily the word that was used. So, to me, visual discourse is not. I mean, why not plastic thought, which seems to think that you're thinking visually.
Can I just interrupt
Sure.
here? The term plastic in French, plastique, and also plastico or plastica in Spanish have different meanings than they do in English. So actually there are many mistranslations of the term plastique and plastica in English from French and Spanish, where the term, for example, arte plástica. Okay, we do not say plastic arts because plastic arts in English means moldable arts, means something that is physical, something that is
more limited,
sculptural. So the term arte plástica should only be translated as either visual art or art.
Okay, or visual thought. But my point was more on the word pensée, into thought.
So visual.
In French, we do say art plastique, and I understand that would be a mistranslation. So I would say like visual thought. Yeah, which I think is the idea.
I'm wondering though, because I'm wondering though here, and I'm not going to interrupt you anymore as if I can help it, but I'm wondering here because actually I think that Luis should explain why he chose discourse over pensée, over thought.
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Yes. I basically, I think the source that I consulted that did not offer thought as a possible translation for pensée. I do recognize it as thoughts, but I guess that discouraged me from using thoughts.
Okay.
And I use discourse because it just seemed to me like the second closest thing, even though I am aware that there is a difference.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. I do think here in pensée plastique really means there's something specific to the way the usual field speaks to you, without necessarily going through language. Or at least here it doesn't use the metaphor of language. Let's put it this way, okay? Which I think is, but yeah, we already mentioned my thing, so I think it's enough on the topic. Now let's go to another example from your introduction. So page 20 from the introduction, so in Roman. So at the end of the first paragraph, you say, well, it seems that the intended word was not signer, but signaler.
Mhm.
But the verb signer can be used to mean signaler.
Okay.
So I don't think that there's the problem here. It's signe le développement. Yeah, it's signe. It means you could translate it as signals. The verb signer in that case.
Okay.
It is this is okay. This would not be a common French thing. It would be a little more refined use of the word, you know. But yeah, it's totally legitimate if you say signer for signal. And the last example, okay. So something that you mentioned, and that's more of a question than I have here. Well, it's both statement and a question. So page 28 in the introduction. So end of your first paragraph, and you mentioned here and the question of painting and how peinture should be translated and the double meaning it might have in French. But I do not think it should be, you said, so I resolve this as the various components of the painting and the act of painting itself. I think you should say the art of painting. Because la peinture is the art of painting, not the act of painting. At least, again, as it is used in common French, faire de la peinture, faire une peinture. So faire une peinture is to make a painting. Faire de la peinture is to paint. So, so it happened. Okay, yeah, in the translation of the text themselves. I think you mean the art of painting, not the act, not the process. So these are the three things I had, you know, like some signé, which was really like the kind of how it's really used idiomatically to mean signal. The art of painting, I would say that's more of the how you interpret it, and the thought for pensée, this is just, I would say, just literal. That a choice that I think is just unnecessary. What you mentioned is that, yeah, do say like plastic, you know, visual discourse, the fight of using discourse for everything, which can be something that you do find a lot, especially after Derrida, precisely, where, you know, any graduate student in complete is going to say, you know, everything is discourse. Or this bottle is a discourse, which this sort of utterance I used to hear a lot when I was studying, where Derrida had his temple in UC Irvine, you know, and some time ago. But it's not the text. Text is pensée, which is just thought. Okay, so maybe that's why you didn't find, you know, that simple literal translation, because it's been an attitude of scholars to see everything through discourse, because everything is discourse. But that's, I would say that's a later, you know, and a more, this is not necessarily what was intended. Anyway, so let's go now to the translation. So I found most problems actually in the first text. So let's go to page 2. Strange choice. So ce qui saute aux yeux, which is again, in idiom French. You put the brightest part of the picture. Why? Why the brightest part?
Yeah, I had originally translated as what is most eye-catching, something like that.
Yes, that's what it means.
Yeah, that's what
Because it could be that what really captures your attention is the fact that it's very gray.
Mhm.
It doesn't
Yeah, of
have to
course.
be bright.
Yeah, the thing
So
is that
your first reflex was better.
yes, the thing is that was my first reflex, but I actually watched the documentary, and the actual words by the museum goer who says this is that the brightest part of the picture. And so I later realized that maybe it's the way in which it was translated into French, what where they
So it's
use
a
the
French
sort of
translation
word
that is
around.
not correct then.
That's what I thought.
Okay. Fine. Okay. Now the following page 3, that where there was in this paragraph a number of, is it by you? Did you translate it or not?
Which, sorry?
The translation from Naja.
No, I took that from a 1960 translation by Richard
It's
Howard.
referenced. You can see that in the citation, translated by Richard Howard.
Wow, lots of problems there. These
Right
are
there.
the worst. So what
Right.
do we? Okay, David, what should be done in this case? Should it be mentioned though? Do you just need it? Lots of problems. I found like
well, look, I mean, the thing is that once a translation is published and it's considered an official translation, if you cite a work, if you're citing Naja by André Breton, you have to go to the translated version. That's what as translators.
understand, but should footnotes be added to mention that there are problems in the translation?
I mean, he could mention it in his preface.
Okay, I'm going to mention just a few problems I see. Okay, there are, I think lots, but the line 3, seen from a certain angle in the street. No, not in the street, from the road, de la route, which is not the same thing. Because the street, typically, you walk on the sidewalk, I mean. Whereas here, it means when you drive on the road, that's what you see. But that's okay, that's a detail. More bizarre is that, line 6, which I'd never heard of. No, not heard of, seen. Again, just like goes way off, the literal meaning. It's not the same thing. Je n'avais jamais vu.
Heard. Okay, yeah, I see.
It's not the same thing. What was it? And then, what was it? Oh yeah, regarded, the worst is, this object was an old engraving which, seen straight on, represents a tiger, but which regarded perpendicularly to the surface of tiny vertical bands. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's because it's not regarded perpendicularly, it's partitioned perpendicularly, compartmentalized by tiny vertical bands. And we've seen these sort of things, you look this way, you look this other way, you see something else. So
there's a choice that translators can make, when they come across a very flawed, and I mean, you'd really have to weigh every decision that Howard made, here, and consider, like, well, okay, is this colloquial? Would this make sense in English? Would this not make? Does this, in the broader framework, is it okay? Is it not okay? But the decision that a translator has is, if they find a published translation that, by the way, may be highly regarded in the literary world by anyone who does not speak French and considered to be a Bible of sorts, which happens all the time. You should see translations of Baudrillard in English. They're absolutely horrifying. But they're quoted in every single philosophy department across the United States, where they still allow them to teach this stuff. But so what can happen is that a translator can say, all right, I'm going to refuse this translation and do it myself. And then they would have to put, translation my own or translation by Luis Reyes, and maybe an explanation that the published version by Richard Howard, is it Richard Howard?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is flawed and contains many errors, which would be drawing attention to that publication, I guess. So but it's a decision that any translator can make. And I mean, in Puerto Rico, for example, we have bad translations into English of Pales Matos. We have bad translations into English of Julia de Burgos. So, there is a legitimate decision by any translator who's tackling anything that's cited to retranslate. And so that could be up to Luis to do that.
Okay. Yeah, so let's not stay too long on this. Let's go page 6, which is, again, a choice you made, and I would like to know why. The second to last line, so it goes, challenge us as reasoning viewers. Why do you put reasoning to translate raisonnable?
Raisonnable, I had originally used reasonable.
Yeah.
Is that the better one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
right,
really, raisonnable means reasonable in the sense of sensible. So we could use raisonnant if you wanted to really be in the process of reasoning. So I think reasonable is just fine.
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't think reasonable works there, frankly.
Or sensible, I don't know.
Sensible is also a false cognate, because that's not sensible.
No, I know, but I mean as reasonable.
Yeah,
why
but
don't you want
why do I object to reasonable here? Because reasonable means, like, if someone's reasonable, they'll go along with anything. You're reasonable, so you'll, if I tell you to do this, you'll do it. Reasonable, doesn't not mean the same thing as raisonnable. I do not think in French, but maybe you're the one.
But what do you think it means? I'm not sure I understand.
I think here, actually, what it means is someone who uses reason.
Okay. What do you understand? Le foisonnement du spectacle.
Because you also gave
perturbe nos habitudes de regardeur raisonnable. Nos habitudes de regardeur raisonnable. I think it means the everyday raisonnable, in the sense that a normal person, that's what a normal person would do in normal habits. That's what I understand in the French. Okay, and that's why I prefer reasonable.
Okay, but you said just a minute ago that raisonnant could be used there too.
No, I said if the author had used raisonnant to mean reasoning. I mean, I meant that you would have to go to great length of using a word that is not really normal, to go out of your way of reasonable, which is the normal word. That's what I meant.
Okay. I still think that there's a semantic difference between raisonnable in French and reasonable in English, but
then why not use rational, if that's what you think?
But that's yes, but there's where reason comes in, and that rational would be great. I think rational is a perfect idea.
Okay, I don't think that's what you translate, because we have rationnel, in French. So I think the choice of reasonable is for raisonnable, but it's okay. You can decide later. You can decide later. You don't have to decide now. Translation of the on page 7. You translate that which I found it strange. So in the quote, last line, I prefer not to look at it. After a while, I'm speechless, which are two different quotes. So, c'est perturbant. Au bout d'un moment, on préfère ne plus regarder. I think the idiomatic translation of on is you in English. You prefer not to look at it a while, and I'm speechless, which is je. So, again, I would not, if I would say that on is used very frequently in oral speech to mean we in French, actually. But the idiomatic use is, we translate as you, which is a you that is impersonal, like any person would. That's what I understand here. Now, let's go to page, no, the next. Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt again. Since this was also, you know, the situation with the Brian De Palma at the Museum of Modern Art, I'm wondering if Luis actually took this from someplace where it was verbatim in English.
Yeah, this is the same situation with the earlier brightest part of the picture quote. I took these from the actual Brian De Palma documentary. So I think that these French translations, I mean, it's cited below. It comes from the Carlotta Films edition. So what I assumed was that the author took them from the subtitles of that film or something. So these are not really my translations. I took them from the documentary.
Okay, good, good to know. Okay, so the following essay, page 14. Again, that's something a little idiomatic. So, l'anneau de vitesse de la ville de Grenoble est resté célèbre. And you translate it like literally has remained famous. I don't think you can translate literally here. Rester célèbre means to garner fame, basically. So it's you could even just say just is famous for, but it means became famous or gain fame for, which is rester célèbre typically means. Same thing with the use of the verb devait at the last line. Ce mur cinétique devait entraîner le regard. And you just said, it's yours, right? Yeah. Drew the gaze. Here, so you did not translate devait. Is there a reason you didn't?
I just felt, I mean, my initial impression was that these modal verbs in French are sometimes omitted in English.
And vice versa. I can see flowers, je vois une. Sometimes the modal verb in English is not translated in French. I do think here, devait entraîner means was supposed to draw.
Okay.
Yeah, or was meant to. Yeah, I would say here, I think he deserves a translation.
I guess I'm more used to thinking of devoir as should, and it didn't ring well to me to use should.
No, should would not work here. Because
So,
should here would translate devrait. Here it's an imperfect, it's devait, so it was like was supposed to.
Meant to.
Yeah. So page 16, here it's more the question of interpreting what it means, I would say. But let's see, where is it in the French? I'm lost now. Solo, oh, here. Yeah, so in the French, you have, comme Jean Epstein l'avait suggéré en son temps, la forme séculaire est précisément celle en laquelle se résout l'aspect des mobiles. And you put, okay, something which I say, like the English is a little strange sometimes, so I don't mention that because that's not my area, but you said is the precisely one. I think you mean the precisely the one, right? Second to last line.
Okay, that's
precisely the one you mean.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's a mistake.
Yeah, precisely the one in which the appearance of mobile elements, and you put dissolves under the effect of the speed. I don't think it means dissolves here. So résout means I think it settles. Just like, you know, a stroboscopic effect is zoom, and then you do see like a circle where there was not. So it's not that the circle appears, it's that it appears actually. So I don't know. I mean settle. You might find a better word, but I think it's just like a bunch of things that boom, and then you see and then you see a circle. Okay. Okay, something that was a little, it's not completely wrong. I would say slightly off. At the end of page 17, you put based on a highly used strategy by the members of the visual arts research group did not, for instance, permanently solicit. It's both the highly used and the permanently, slightly off for me. So, because, qui sollicite en permanence, selon une stratégie hautement assumée. I would rather translate based on a much claimed strategy. Assumer means that you do things with intent, purpose. You say, that's what I do. That's why I do it. I think then you can just forget the permanently. If you say claimed, you know, because it's something that you go for it. So I don't have the translation. I'm just mentioning here, highly used is not exactly assumer. Assumer means you claim it, like you assume. Assumer is like your sexuality, you know, boom, you say, you're not in the closet, boom, you say, that's what I am. So here the strategy means there's intention, there's so okay, then more of a question, page 18. You did something complicated here for sanamorphose, which is obviously some sort of, you know, neologism. You put which congeal the amorphous appearance. I don't know. Is that what anamorphose? I understand anamorphose is something that TVs have been doing for a while. You know, like you had something on the screen and it's sort of. So anamorphose is not congealing something amorphous. Anamorphosing is sort of changing the proportions.
Yeah, or viewing it from an odd angle, so that
Yeah,
it changes.
yeah, but it's not congealing an amorphous appearance.
No, anamorphosis.
So
Yep.
I would say either you accept it's a sort of anamorphose, or you just find something else.
No, but in English, anamorphosis.
Okay, then use anamorphosis. I would say, yeah, here it deserves a literal translation.
So anamorphosed, the appearance.
Anamorphosis. But this is the very famous painting, The Ambassadors, if I'm not wrong, by Hans Holbein, is probably the earliest example of that. Yeah, anamorphosis. I mean, I could share this so that everybody understands. I mean, I'm sure Mercedes Trelles, I'm sure, understands what this is, but I'll if I may, this is an example. Can everyone see this?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I'm trying to get it larger, but I guess that didn't work. Yeah. But there's a skull here
Yeah.
at the bottom of the painting that only when you see it from an angle at a distance does it appear as a full skull. So that is anamorphosis.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay, at the end of the page, there's a which, I think, which doesn't belong there. Like in the same vein, it would be quite easy to prove that the polyvisuality brought into play by Jacob pointed to the development. I think there's no which here.
Well, there's also that Cruz Diaz needs an S at the end. It's not Z apostrophe, it's Z apostrophe S.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I'm coming too close here, so I'm gonna forget about little things because there I'll send it to you, so you'll have all my notes. I'm going to a bigger one, which again is a problem of so page I would say a problem of the of just ESL FSL, French as a second language, page 27. So it was défense de ne pas participer, défense de ne pas toucher, défense de ne pas casser. So this is like something you see everywhere in French, like on walls. You see défense de fumer, défense d'afficher, and you translate in no smoking. You know, or when you see in English, you know, like no littering, you know. So I think you should translate it as something like no, not participating. And you would have the idea that, oh, like that's what you would see on a sign. No, not forbidding. No, not breaking. Because if you say it is forbidden not to participate, it's not supposed to be a sentence. It's supposed to be like basically a threat, you know, because you're going to be fined. See what I'm saying? And yeah, everything else, I had other notes. It took a lot of time. The others are kind of the same, you know, like a modal verb here, an adjective, and but it's all in my notes. So basically, I do think you have a good method. I do think most of the translation is good, and so far as I can see from the translations you quoted, better than average. I would just recommend, so since you do want to continue, you know, to work in French, teach French, translate French, yes, to find ways to be more, to gain more idioms, which typically for which you don't need to do anything else than consume normal French, like basically any French content, and sometimes even just like popular culture, whatever, you know, the things that would be very idiomatic. And you could tell because it comes from the mouth of anybody, you know. But as far as you work as a translator, I think you did a good job. And by the way, I like also your choice of text. These texts are fascinating. So I think I enjoyed reading all of them, and so thank you for the opportunity. And I'm done.
Okay, thank you very much, Antoine Philippe. And now if we could pass to Mercedes Trelles, please. So for your comments on the translation work, on the thesis as a whole.
Of course, thank you. I want to congratulate Luis. He chose a difficult project. It's also somewhat difficult art. especially because the texts, the original texts, were very different in style, which you point out in your introduction. And so there's also going to be differences in the comments about each translation because they're very, very different. Op and kinetic art is sort of a niche in art history and late 20th century modernism. And for a period, I thought I was going to study that for my dissertation. I was going to do that, my dissertation work. So I was a little surprised at the comment that it was sort of universally despised, rejected. I think the reception was much more nuanced than that. The splinter groups or parts of this movement, like Grave, were very popular and very well respected. It depends on who you were talking to. So I just wanted to point that out because I am familiar with the artwork and its reception. I read a lot of art historical English. I was trained for my PhD in the States, so my colleagues are all Spaniards, and we have a lot of differences on the use of language and the way we approach the subject. And I can say that some of the choices, which you explained very well in your introduction, that are foreignizing is, I think, the word you use, the retention of certain words in French was hard for me. I understand the use of moire. It's used all the time in all the languages, and I'm going to give you an example. I have to hunt for it, but if you give me a second, I'll find it. And of course, I'm not being able to do this right now. And I think I also shared my comments before, so you know what I'm talking about. But let me see if I can find it. I pointed them out in a different color. Regime, for example, or fait opéral. I struggle with those within the text because I thought you could find a translation for both. Maybe it's not a direct translation, and I understand I'm not, a professor of the translation department, but there is a point where you do have to do some work so that your reader feels more comfortable with your material. So those would be two examples that come to mind. There's a couple of, okay. And then it's clear to me that Arnauld Pierre, at least from my reading, was the hardest to translate. And I went back to the French and found the sentences and found them incredibly long. So definitely very, very hard to work in preserving the meaning of what he was trying to communicate. But within the Arnauld Pierre, page 17, some translations like thread pitches, for example, lost me completely. I have no idea what we're talking about. None. Just what is it? And I went back and tried to see what I think it was avis. What is it? What is this thing what are we talking about? So I was very concerned with some, and it's not frequent, but it did happen, and in my sense, it happens more in Arnauld Pierre than anywhere else. There's a sentence at the end of this page that goes on to the first one, the beginning of the next page, which is, it's a forest. It just goes on and on and on. And it's not you. I went back to the French. It's exactly like that in French. But there's something about the cadence in French that isn't quite captured in the English translation. And then you sort of lose your reader. I did a lot of jargony reading and still do sometimes. And so this is not exactly jargon, but cynosures is a word that I had to look up, and that I think could be resolved in a different way so that your reader feels
Right.
more comfortable with a material that is hard to begin with. So I think that's basically My comments are very general. I think it's a very good translation. I think the other part is instance vocale. There I felt like definitely you could find a good translation for that. That there's no need to, and I don't mean to upset Antoine Philippe, but to Frenchify the text. It can just go, with something different than instance vocale. I had a comment and a question about the names of artistic movements. Because I write in Spanish and English, I struggle a lot with this, where in English, to my knowledge, they're all capitalized. Op art, kinetic art, whereas in pop art, surrealism, it needs to be the ism, right? It needs to be like the official title of the thing. But correct me if I'm wrong, because in Spanish, it's never is. So there's always a struggle with this.
It depends. It really depends. And it depends also on the style guide that's being used. And Luis, I think that you had access to the art editor's style guide, didn't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think I mentioned that to you. It's very bizarre, but there's some movements that are not capitalized, and there's some movements that are.
Okay.
And I just wish they were all capitalized so that, we'd have something to work with. And then it also depends on the context, because sometimes Gothic is capitalized and sometimes it's not, capitalized. So
yeah, I know, I understand. If it's like an adjective, it's not, but if it's the actual name of the thing, then it is. So I wanted to point that out because at one point during the reading, I went like, wait, some of these are in caps and others aren't. Maybe this is something to bring in the introduction, because this is very specific to translating for art. Very specific to art and very difficult, because French doesn't do that either, like Spanish, not necessarily goes in caps. So it creates this whole sort of somebody who's used to doing art history reading, it creates between languages, it creates a sort of sense of question. What I'm, how is this done in this language?
Yeah, I just have a question. Luis, did you use Chicago Manual of Style?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Then I think I have to look there. And I have to say the Chicago Manual of Style is the most chaotic thing I've ever read in my life. So, I mean, it's terrible. But that's a very interesting point. And thank you. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted to know about the style guide.
Not at all. So basically, those are my main observations, that I struggled much more with the Arnauld Pierre than with any of the others, and that I went back and looked at it and I understand why. And that some of the use of foreign terms, regime, féodal, can be resolved. I'm not gonna, suggest how, because that's actually your job. But I feel very strongly that they can be resolved. And with the first text, with the introduction, the speaking of the illusion, the place that reads like police instead of Maison Rouge. I think what they're describing is precisely anamorphosis. That when you move, it resolves into something different. And I wonder, and I don't know how you do things in translation, whether you can maybe to clarify for the reader at a footnote at some point and say, this sounds very much like this and this, and maybe give the Hans Holbein example. Because otherwise you read it and you're like, what, I know it's surrealist literature, but still you're going, what are they talking about? I have no idea. That's not your translation. That's like the original story as done in this sort of like very sort of mysterious way, where, anamorphosis exists since the 16th century and painting, and everybody knows what it is. So, that's
isn't there I mean, you know, I mean, I read Naja many years ago, but I always took that work to have such a sense of humor, you know, that it was really kind of, you know, pulling the Mickey, as you know, might be said in English, on the reader, and so I think, you know, just the sense of the absurd.
There is, yeah, you go
And
like,
so, you know, I'm trying to think, would there be any way, anamorphotically, would there be any way to get police out of Maison Rouge? Would it be possible? Or is this just a joke? It's kind of a visual joke that André Breton was playing.
I'm pretty sure it's a joke. I kept thinking the same thing, going, well, I mean, the letters just don't add up. So there's no angle in which you could understand this with letters, but it's a really interesting project. I'm fascinated by the differences between the authors and how their style is very different, and poses different challenges. So thank you for this lovely work that you've done.
Okay, thank you very much, Mercedes. And I think that we need to go to the next step here, which is Barbara has to come in and escort Luis out of the room so that we can deliberate and come to a decision about the evaluation. All right. Welcome back, Luis, and welcome back, everybody. Those who are watching out there on YouTube. Luis, we want to congratulate you on a great project that was extremely difficult. And I have to say that your presentation today was particularly, it was really tremendous, really tremendous. So we have decided, you know, Antoine and Mercedes have their suggestions and their comments that they will pass on to you. But we unanimously voted on a sobresaliente for this project. So congratulations. And it was great working with you, Luis. So applause.
Felicidades.
Thank you very much.
Felicidades.
Félicitations.
Félicitations aussi. Okay, so I think, Barbara, we can